In most of our previous examples, we saw that sometimes the position where we start to calculate already bears certain motives which could give us an idea of a tactical execution. And sometimes it works, or rather very often in practice it works slightly differently. We see the position where we clearly define our strategical plan, our objective, and we start executing it. And when our opponent tries to fight against our strategy, somehow the position slightly changes and tactical possibilities come to the fore. Well, in order to be able to explain this, let us pay our attention to my game against Vitigov, who was world champion under 18 some time ago, which was played in the same tournament like my game against Karpov, which I showed you earlier in Tallinn, Keres Memorial, Rapid Chess 2006. So if we take a look at this position, we will basically not be mistaken if we will assume that tactically not much is going on, or in fact very little. Some tactical motives could very often be found even if they do not seem to be there. Well, what can we see in this position? First of all, strategically, we see that, in fact, knight on c6 is not so well placed. It cannot go to e5, it cannot go to d4, it cannot go to a5, cannot go to d4. So, a pretty passive knight. And of course, first of all, you think, how can I improve my piece? What can I do? Well, and in this position, there are possibilities. You can bring your piece, or you can try to bring your piece to the best square, to c3. And it is just 3 moves. You go to e7, you go to d5, you come to c3. And on c3, it would be excellently placed, hitting the queen, the pawn on e2, blocking the rook on b3, and so on. So you see the possibility, and you basically start to calculate, does it work? Knight e7. What could be the drawbacks of this? Here you see, b7 is hanging. But then when you take a closer look, so okay, I will play knight d5, then I will play in the center and on the king side, might go like e4, knight c3, and the queen would be badly stuck on b7. So nothing to be afraid of. Black could even try with an idea of rook a8 and rook fb8 to catch white's queen. So this is nothing to be afraid of. So we return to the position after knight e7, and we see, okay, I threaten knight d5, what can he do? He will, you would think, most normally try to use the fact the situation has changed and maybe attack this pawn, which is no longer defended. How can he do this? You look at knight f3, you see, no, d3 is hanging. They cannot do this. But he could first play rook f3 to exchange the rook, because after rook f3, knight f3, the pawn is hanging, and black has no time to execute his maneuver. But you have your plan, and you just go knight d5. He takes rook f8, rook f8, and in accordance with his own plan, he goes knight f3. Now he thinks that he created a threat of knight takes d4, using the fact that e6 is not protected, and he also created the threat of queen takes e5 or knight takes e5. Thus, he believes he distracts you from your plan. But before being upset about your plan being distracted, you should check, maybe it works anyway. Maybe you can play knight c3. And you try to see, what can he do? Well, first of all, he can use his own tactics. After all, he threatened knight takes d4 and take on d4. And now, if e takes d4, he will take your queen. And if knight takes e4, he will take knight e6. But we should remember, when we were first defining our plans and ideas, we said that this beautiful knight on c3 will be hitting e4 and e2. And what does this actually mean? It means that the knight hitting e2 also hits d4 because of the poking possibilities. So now it is all very simple. We just go somewhere. Queen is hanging. Queen takes. We take on d4. Queen takes d4, knight e2, and collect the queen on d4. So very simple. But is there all to it? No. You can also take queen e5. But then we see we have a check. And checks are always important. Now we are beginning somehow to annoy his king. And is it sufficient? Can he go king h1? Well, when you are looking at this position, it might not even be necessary to see a direct tactical solution. You see that basically black has a passed pawn on d4, fairly active pieces, puts pressure, and maybe could continue just with queen c4, after which the knight would be hanging on f3, and black would create the threat of knight g3. But can't white play a bit more solidly, play king g2, for instance, to have the knight on f3 protected? And what would black do? Can he use this pin? At first it seems that no, he cannot do it, and that he has to take on e5, knight takes e5, and go for this ending, which is perfectly alright for white. But then we do not despair, and remember that we saw in some of our previous lines, we saw that in fact the knight on f3 can become vulnerable. We saw that it was hanging, that we can attack it, we can pin it, and so on. And seeing this, we see, can't we use this somehow tactically? Can't we somehow expose this knight in such a way that black could capture it or attack it comfortably? And then we check our possibilities to give checks or to capture. We saw that queen e5 is nothing, and now we just check what happens after knight f4. The only check we have at our disposal, which makes sense. And then we see that after g takes f4, you give check on g4, king h1 only move, you give a check, king g1, and you come crashing through. And you see, it's just all easy. Check, check, check. But after knight f4 check, or in fact before knight f4 check, you should answer also other questions. What do I do if he doesn't take the knight? For instance, if he goes king h1. And then you remember. Or rather, when you develop your tactical skills, you no longer remember, but you feel the weakness of this diagonal, because there is king on h1. And you see that you just play queen c6, and white cannot protect the knight. And it's pretty much the same, like the other line. Well, then you wonder what happens after king g1. First of all, you register in your mind, just in case, that knight e2 will repeat the position. You look at knight h3 check as well, and king g2, you do not see much of gain. You return to position after king g1 and try to apply the same tactical means which worked in the other line. You remember that queen c6 was decisive after king h1, and try this again. It is without check, but it is a direct attack at the weakness of white's position, as we saw, and we see, in fact, white's knight cannot be defended. If it goes somewhere, it is suddenly mate. And as it cannot be protected, white can only take black's knight, and as the queen takes f3, black comes crashing through on f4, g4, and in fact, white's king cannot be protected anymore. and in this pretty sad position, white resigned. So, as we always did, we go back to the beginning and see where we started. We started in a position where nothing was going on. We, in fact, only found the correct strategic plan with knight e7 and this transfer to c3. And after our opponent started to fight against our correct strategic plan, his position developed certain weaknesses which we were able to use in the tactical way. And that's the way it is done. First of all, correct strategic plan and tactics as means of executing the correct strategic plan. And we will see a lot of examples confirming this golden rule as we go on with our work.